President Joe Biden returning from a trip overseas, meeting with NATO partners and visiting troops in Poland. During his trip to Brussels, President Joe Biden promised the U.S. will act if Russia uses chemical or biological weapons against Ukraine. The president also pledged $1 billion to humanitarian aid for Ukraine and says the U.S. will take in 100,000 refugees. But he says the best thing NATO can do to stop the conflict is stand together against Putin. My guest this morning is the chair of the Department of Political Science at North Central College. Professor Bill Muck joins me with more on the plan ahead. Bill, good to see you. It's always nice to see you.
Hey, Paul, great to be here to talk politics.
So, okay, the president just attending this emergency NATO meeting. We hear a lot about sanctions, economic sanctions, but the president, when asked in a press conference, said, look, this isn't about deterrence because they're not working. Except Vice President Harris, she had said earlier that these sanctions are about deterrence. So are they or aren't they? Or is it just because they're not working?
Well, it depends on what the goal is, right? And so anytime you talk about sanctions, the goal is the key. If the goal was to prevent or deter Vladimir Putin from invading or to get him to turn around very quickly, those haven't worked. But if the goal is to slowly and methodically squeeze the Russian economy over time, then they may prove to be quite effective. I think what we're watching here is really a battle of 21st century techniques. Is the economic battle being waged against Russia, or is the military battle that Russia is waging against Ukraine? Which one's going to win first? And I think over time, the economic ones are really, really, really powerful. And it may change how each party wants to come to these negotiating tactics.
Well, while we have the economic sanctions going on, the president has been clear about what he won't do. We're not putting troops on the ground. We won't support a no-fly zone to be part of that because that will start and escalate the conflict. I was just sort of curious, though. My question to you is it wise to transmit to Putin what we're not willing to do? Because Putin basically says anything might happen on his end.
Well, it's really fascinating to watch this out because Russia is telling us everything they're about to do. And Biden and NATO are doing the exact opposite. They're saying, here's the clear thing that we're not going to do. And the reality is, I don't know if one tactic is better than the other. I think what we're watching is this grand geostrategic game being played out between the United States and Russia. And they're sending each other signals. And Putin is sending signals to Biden to say, here's my red line. Here's what you can't do. And I think Biden is also trying to send signals to Russia to say, here's what we're going to do, but here's what we won't do. And I think the hope is that through that sort of very awkward communication, you can avoid escalating. So I think this really is all about communicating, and I think Biden and NATO trying to be careful about the message that they're sending to Russia.
So Biden says it's certainly possible that Russia could use chemical weapons. That seems to put other options on the table. I'm just sort of curious, do you think NATO and the U.S. will take a different stance about troops, no-fly zones, if in fact Putin crosses that line? The president isn't clear about what he'd do.
No, he's been very coy about it. And my sense is that the United States would respond if Russia does chemical weapons, but it doesn't mean we would respond with troops on the ground or even a military attack. I think, the only thing that might be able to push the United States in that direction is the humanitarian situation. As the conditions on the ground, as the war crimes continue to play out, that's the real pressure that I think might push the Biden administration. I'm not so sure that chemical weapons will.
What about a cyber attack on the U.S.? Because there's been some talk that Putin could do that to the United States.
Well, this is where it gets really, really interesting, because with conventional tactics, we know how to respond. If one country launches an attack on the other, you know what a proportional response is. When it comes to a cyber attack, there are no rules yet. This is such a new weapon. It really only goes back to the tail end of the George W. Bush administration, where states started using this in an offensive way. So if Russia always is carrying out some form of cyber attack against the United States, but if they carried out a major attack, how would the U.S. respond? Would they respond with conventional means? Would they respond with their own form of cyber attack? And then the real dangerous question here is, once you start dealing with cyber attacks, it's very, very easy to escalate. So you could have a cyber attack quickly turn into a much more robust conventional attack. So cyber, there are no rules, and we're just figuring this out as we go.
Most experts basically looking at this, you can agree or disagree with them, basically say this war is not going the way Putin expected it to go. He thought this would be a 3-4 day affair and he would be, that'd be it. That's not happened that way. But my question is, if Putin were to decide that he needed to end this war, he won't do it without trying to find a way to claim a victory. Is there a way for him to do that?
Yeah, so this is where I think a lot of the conversations are right now is how do you find an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin that allows him to at least not lose? My sense is that it's going to be about territory, that at the end of the day, Russia's going to want territory. Maybe a formal acknowledgement of Crimea as being part of Russia, maybe those two pro-Russian separatist areas as independent. So this may be the one thing that Russia would accept. Now, the question is, can Zelensky and Ukraine accept that? Zelensky has been out traveling around the world talking about this conflict as an existential battle for freedom and democracy in the world. Can he then turn around and say that we're willing to give up this territory? I think that's going to be a really bitter pill to swallow. But what we've seen through history is oftentimes wars are fought for grand reasons, but then the settlements of those wars are far less ideal. So I think territory may be that one sticking point.
Just real briefly, former President Trump has said this would have never happened if he was still in office. Is that a plausible scenario?
I don't think so. I think Putin was going to do what Putin was going to do, depending on if it was Biden or Trump, it wouldn't have mattered. I think Putin saw weakness in NATO, not weakness in a U.S. president, and he went to exploit that. What we saw is that NATO was much more united. I think Joe Biden deserves some credit for part of that as well.
While I have you here, we had this week, of course, the hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Your reaction, Republicans said to her, we are not going to treat you the way Democrats did Brett Kavanaugh. Of course, then we saw some of the things that went on. Did they treat her more respectfully than Democrats treated Kavanaugh?
No, not at all, right? I mean, this was it turned into political theater. You're hearing lots of analysts talk about that race hovered over it. I think race was at the absolute center of all of this. Democrats talking about the historic moment that this represented, the first black woman being nominated to the Supreme Court. Republicans on the other side going back to arguments about blacks being soft on crime, critical race theory. So I mean, it felt like race was driving this conversation in a really uncomfortable way. It made me think about back to Barack Obama when he was elected, and even individuals who didn't vote for Barack Obama were able to celebrate this historic moment. So maybe they didn't agree with Obama, but they noted it was an important time for the country. I don't think we saw that in this Supreme Court hearing. It showed the ugliness and the way in which race is continuing to divide the country.
Yeah. All right, Professor Bill Muck, thanks for your time this Sunday morning. Have a great rest of your weekend. We'll talk to you again soon. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
All right.